The year is 2026, and the long-awaited S1 filing from Anthropic has finally hit the SEEK's EDGR system, sending a tremor through the entire developer ecosystem. We are looking at a staggering $965 billion valuation, fueled by the explosive success of Claude Code, which generated over $1 billion in revenue within its first 6 months of release. For years, developers treated Claude as a benevolent research partner, but this document signals a point of no return. The constitutional AI era is being rapidly overlaid by the corporate AI era, where every token generated must now justify a $1 trillion market cap. This isn't just about a successful IPO. It's about a fundamental shift in the cost of intelligence. If your current CI/CD pipeline and automated coding agents are built exclusively on Claude's API, your infrastructure budget is no longer under your control. By the end of this lecture, you will understand exactly how this financial gravity will force you to re-architect your entire stack. But valuation is just the surface. The real danger lies in the hidden metrics of the S1 filing that dictate your future subscription costs. As senior decision makers, we must look past the hype and evaluate the structural risk of vendor lock-in. When a foundational model provider goes public, their primary fiduciary duty shifts from safety research to shareholder value maximization. This transition often leads to aggressive API pricing strategies and the deprecation of less profitable, legacy model versions that your systems might still rely on. We need to establish a strict decision framework. Do you double down on the Anthropic ecosystem for its superior reasoning capabilities, or do you pivot to a multi-model strategy to maintain leverage? History shows that early infrastructure partners often get squeezed once the provider needs to show quarterly margin growth. You need to ask yourself if your current Claude-first architecture is a strategic advantage or a single point of failure that will break your budget by Q4. Is your infrastructure robust enough to survive a 300% price hike, or will you be the one subsidizing their shareholder dividends? This approach might seem pessimistic, but in the world of public infrastructure, it's the only way to stay solvent. The transition from a private AI lab to a public corporation is a transformation of the company's DNA. In the research phase, Anthropic focused on scaling laws and ERLAF concepts that prioritized model intelligence and safety. However, the S1 filing reveals a pivot toward margin scaling. Public markets demand predictable, recurring revenue and expanding profit margins. This means that the developer-first ethos that characterized the early Claude 3.5 Sonnet days is evolving into an enterprise-first focus. We are seeing a move away from raw performance metrics toward operational efficiency and managed services. For us on the ground, this translates to fewer breakthrough updates and more monetization updates. Features that improve your productivity, but don't contribute to Anthropic's bottom line, like high-limit free tiers or low-latency experimental endpoints, are likely the first to be trimmed. The shift in DNA from researcher to retailer changes everything, especially how they prioritize API stability versus new feature releases. The question isn't whether the model will get better, but whether it will get better in ways that you can actually afford. The most telling part of the S1 isn't the total revenue, but the customer concentration. The number of customers spending over $1 million annually has doubled in the last year alone. This massive enterprise adoption creates a gravity that pulls the developer ecosystem towards specific high-value use cases, often at the expense of general-purpose development. When a company like Anthropic optimizes for Fortune 500 contracts, the individual developer's leverage decreases. You might find that the API features you rely on for your niche startup are being sidelined in favor of features that help a global bank automate its compliance department. This is the enterprise trap. The model evolves to serve the whales, leaving the rest of us with a tool that is either too expensive or too specialized for general coding tasks. Understanding these growth patterns allows us to predict which parts of the Claude ecosystem will receive the most investment and which will be left to wither. This enterprise focus explains why certain features you've been begging for are being ignored, and we'll look at the historical precedent for this shift in the next chapter as we analyze the patterns of previous infrastructure IPOs like GitHub and MongoDB. To understand where Anthropic is headed, we must first look at the giants who paved the way for infrastructure as a service. Companies like MongoDB, Elastic, and even GitHub followed a very specific trajectory. In the early stages, their primary goal was developer mindshare, the adoption at all costs phase. They offered generous free tiers and open source versions to ensure that every developer's local machine or startup stack included their technology. However, the transition to being a public company changes the fundamental DNA of an organization. Once the S1 is filed and the IPO is complete, the focus shifts from growth via adoption to growth via extraction. We've seen this cycle repeatedly over the last decade. A company gains dominance through community trust, only to pivot toward high-margin enterprise features once quarterly earnings reports become the primary metric of success. This historical pattern is the blueprint for what we should expect in the 2026 AI market landscape. But here is the critical question. Why does the shift from private to public always seem to correlate with a sudden tightening of the developer's belt? We will see that the answer lies in the massive capital requirements of the underlying infrastructure. When a company goes public, the free tier is no longer a marketing expense. It is viewed by Wall Street as a liability. Looking at the history of MongoDB and Elastic, we see a distinct shift in license models post-IPO. They moved from permissive Apache or MIT licenses to more restrictive ones like SPL, server-side public license. This wasn't just a legal change, it was a monetization strategy. They needed to stop freeloaders, including large cloud providers, from profiting off their hard work without returning revenue. For you as a developer, this meant that the tool you built your entire architecture around suddenly had new limitations or significantly higher costs for production-scale deployment. In the context of Anthropic, this transition is even more dangerous because the resource isn't just code, its proprietary model weights and inference compute. If history serves as a guide, we should anticipate that the community or evaluation tiers of the Claude API will become significantly more restricted as Anthropic seeks to prove to investors that they can convert 90% of their user base into high-paying enterprise customers. But wait, this isn't just about licensing. It's about building a technical wall that no competitor can climb over. To protect their revenue from being cannibalized by cloud giants like AWS, Google, or Azure, infrastructure companies have historically built technical moats. These moats are often architectural. For example, by creating proprietary extensions or cloud-only features that are not available in the open-source version, companies ensure that the best version of their product is only accessible via their own paid platform. In the developer ecosystem, this often manifests as vendor lock-in. We see this with Elastic's proprietary features and MongoDB's Atlas-specific optimizations. For Anthropic, the moat is the Claude ecosystem, including proprietary tools like Claude Code and specialized weights that aren't available for local hosting. As they approach an IPO, expect these moats to deepen. They will likely introduce proprietary protocols or optimize DKs that only work at maximum efficiency when using their most expensive, tiered endpoints. This forces your development budget to accommodate not just the tokens you use, but the tax of staying within their optimized ecosystem. However, this is where the traditional software model breaks down because the cost of maintaining an AI moat is infinitely higher than maintaining a database moat. We must recognize that AI infrastructure is fundamentally different from the SaaS or database companies of the past. Why? Because of compute debt. Traditional SaaS companies like Salesforce or Workday have gross margins in the 70–80% range because the cost of serving one additional user is nearly zero. In contrast, every single token Claude generates costs Anthropic a significant amount in GPU compute, electricity, and cooling. With the rise of the NVIDIA H200 and the upcoming Blackwell chips, the capital expenditure required just to stay competitive is astronomical. If Anthropic goes public with a Tyron 900B plus valuation, they are essentially carrying billions in compute debt that must be serviced. This means their token margin, the profit they make per 1M tokens, is under constant pressure. Unlike MongoDB, where the software was the product, here the product is a processed resource derived from expensive hardware. This massive overhead makes an AI IPO far riskier than any software IPO we've seen before. If the cost of compute doesn't drop faster than the price wars, your API costs won't just stay high, they might actually increase as the company prioritizes margin over market share. Is it even possible for a public AI company to remain developer-friendly? The answer lies in their filing strategy. The contrast between Anthropic and its competitors is striking. OpenAI operates as a complex hybrid of a non-profit and a capped profit entity, allowing it to hide certain financial realities from the public. Google Gemini is subsidized by the massive search advertising machine. Anthropic, however, is positioning itself as a public benefit corporation, PBC. While this sounds developer-friendly, an S1 filing in 2026 will strip away the mystery. Unlike OpenAI, a public Anthropic cannot hide its burn rate or its dependency on Amazon and Google for compute. This transparency is a double-edged sword. For us as developers, it means we can finally see the unit economics of a model like Claude 3.5 Sonnet. If the S1 reveals that Anthropic is losing money on every API call to gain market share, you can bet that the first order of business after the IPO will be a price correction. This is the fundamental difference. OpenAI can afford to be opaque and subsidized. Anthropic, once public, must be profitable and transparent. This shift in structure will dictate whether they remain a partner to the developer community or become a landlord. But most shocking part isn't the cost, it's the valuation that drives it. Finally, we must address the Tyron 965 billion elephant in the room. When a company is valued at nearly $1 trillion, market isn't just expecting growth, it's expecting total market dominance and aggressive revenue extraction. To justify such a staggering multiple, Anthropic must find ways to increase the average revenue per user, RPU, dramatically. This usually happens in three ways: increasing API prices, introducing premium API features that were previously free, or creating a tiered ecosystem where the most capable models are reserved for platinum partners. For a developer or a startup founder, this means your 2026 roadmap cannot assume current API pricing will hold. The Tyron 965B valuation isn't a badge of honor. It's a mandate for Anthropic to maximize its take rate from your application's revenue. If you are building a service on Claude today, you are essentially building on a platform that is legally obligated to charge you as much as the market will bear. Now that we've seen the historical context and the unique risks of AI, let's look at the actual S1 document. In the next chapter, we will decode the specific numbers and the impact clauses that will directly hit your development budget. When we look at Anthropic's S1 filing, The primary growth engine isn't just the Claude web interface, it is the integration of Claude Code into the developer's terminal. Unlike standard chat interactions where one prompt equals one response, agentic workflows like Claude Code operate on a recursive loop. Every single fix this bug command triggers a chain of events: file system indexing, context retrieval, multi-step reasoning, and verification loops. From a senior developer's perspective, we are moving from linear token consumption to exponential consumption. In a public company framework, this is a monetization dream. The S1 reveals that revenue per developer is projected to scale not by headcount, but by the complexity of the agentic tasks performed. If your team is using Claude 3.7 or the rumored 2026 models for autonomous refactoring, you aren't just paying for an IDE, you are paying for a high-frequency compute operation that could easily triple your current infrastructure budget. But the real surprise lies in how these costs are hidden behind the veil of efficiency improvements. Does the time saved actually offset the massive spike in API calls? Let's break down the hidden layers of this agentic stack. As Anthropic transitions into a public entity, the pressure to demonstrate stable, high-margin ARR will inevitably lead to feature tearing. Based on the S1's focus on enterprise-grade reliability, we can expect a significant shift in what we consider standard features. Currently, many developers enjoy broad access to high-tier models with minimal gatekeeping. Post-IPO, look for managed agents to become the new enterprise standard. This means features like long-term memory across sessions, priority access to low-latency inference, and advanced project organization will likely be locked behind premium subscriptions. For a lead engineer, this creates a dilemma. Do you keep your team on the basic API and risk lower productivity, or do you commit to a seat-based enterprise license that carries a 40% premium? The S1 hints at a managed infrastructure layer where Anthropic handles the agent's state and memory, effectively creating a proprietary agent OS that makes switching to a competitor like OpenAI or an open-source Llama model extremely painful. This isn't just about a better model. It's about building a walled garden where your agent's history is the ultimate lock-in mechanism. But wait until you see how they plan to restructure the API pricing itself to ensure these margins. Financial analysts reading the S1 are focusing heavily on gross margin expansion. For Anthropic, this translates to a more aggressive API pricing strategy for high-volume users. In 2026, the flat-rate API pricing we are used to might be replaced by a more complex, tiered structure based on context efficiency. We are already seeing hints of this with prompt catching. The future likely involves dynamic rate limits based on your subscription tier and the computational intensity of the request. For example, thinking models that use chain-of-thought processing may be billed at a higher multiplier than standard inference. If your CI/CD pipeline relies on Claude for automated code reviews, you could see a sudden 2x increase in operational costs if you're moved to a high-reliability tier. We must also consider the potential for token inflation where newer, more capable models actually require more tokens to achieve the same result due to more verbose reasoning. As a technical decision maker, your 2026 budget needs to account for at least a 25% of public company tax as Anthropic optimizes for quarterly earnings. Is the safe AI brand enough to justify this premium? Let's analyze the actual value of that safety label in the next section. Anthropic's core identity is built on constitutional AI. In the S1, this isn't just a research philosophy, it's marketed as a primary competitive advantage for the enterprise. As a public company, Anthropic will lean heavily into the narrative that safety is a feature. For developers, this means that Claude is positioned as the only model you can trust with sensitive codebase logic without it hallucinating dangerous security vulnerabilities or violating internal governance policies. But this safety comes with a literal cost. The computational overhead of running safety checks and the constitution during every inference adds to the latency and the price. In the 2026 landscape, we will see governance as a service where companies pay extra for models that are pre-aligned with specific industry regulations like HIPAA or GDPR. This safe AI premium turns a moral stance into a high-margin product. You aren't just paying for the answer. You're paying for the guarantee that the answer won't get your company sued or leaked. Is it a real technical moat or just effective marketing for the board of directors? The answer lies in the legal protections they are about to offer. One of the most critical sections of a post-IPO terms of service involves legal indemnity. As Anthropic seeks to capture the Fortune 500 market, they will offer what we call a copyright shield, a promise to defend their users against copyright infringement claims arising from the model's output. For a development lead, this is a massive green flag for adopting Claude Code across a 1,000-person engineering org. However, this protection is rarely free. It will likely be bundled into high-tier enterprise contracts, creating a clear divide. The pro users get a powerful model, but the enterprise users get a model plus a legal insurance policy. This change in the US will make it nearly impossible for smaller, open-source-based AI providers to compete in the enterprise space, as they lack the balance sheet to offer similar legal guarantees. We need to evaluate whether these protections are truly standard, or if they are just another way to inflate the contract value for a public company hungry for growth. But beyond the legal shield, there is an even more powerful way they will lock you in: your own data silos. Finally, we must talk about the fine-tuning silo. The S1 highlights Anthropic's ability to create private versions of Claude for large clients. While we've seen fine-tuning before, the 2026 iteration will be more about knowledge distillation and private silos. Anthropic will offer to host your proprietary codebase in a secure, isolated environment where Claude learns your specific architectural patterns, naming conventions, and internal APIs. Once your entire team's workflow is optimized for a version of Claude that knows your internal SDK 2.0 better than your own documentation, the cost of switching to another model becomes astronomical. This creates a high switching cost ecosystem. You aren't just using an LLM, you are building a custom brain for your company that only lives on Anthropic's hardware. The S1 reveals that this custom model revenue is expected to be the stickiest part of their business. As developers, we must ask, are we building on a foundation or are we renting a brain that we can never take with us? This leads us to our next critical question. How do these high costs and silos perform in the real world compared to the competition? Let's dive into the benchmarks and adoption risks in the next chapter. When we analyze the technical benchmarks for Core Claude 3.5 Sonnet against competitors like GPT-4o and Llama 3.1, we see a highly competitive landscape. Currently, Claude 3.5 Sonnet occupies a sweet spot for developers, offering superior reasoning for complex coding tasks at a lower price point than the heaviest frontier models. However, we must look at the S1 data critically. Anthropic's current pricing strategy is clearly designed for market share acquisition, not immediate margin optimization. As they transition to a public entity in 2026, the pressure to demonstrate unit economic profitability will likely force a revision of these API tiers. For a large-scale codebase migration, relying on current rates without a buffer for IPO-driven inflation is a major strategic risk. We're seeing token throughput being prioritized over raw accuracy in some updates, which might satisfy shareholders but can break frail RAG pipelines. But performance isn't just about the numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the reliability of the service when your production environment is on the line. A critical component of the Anthropic S1 is the focus on an enterprise-grade reliability. As a public company, Anthropic will likely move towards more robust service-level agreements, SLAs, to satisfy institutional clients. While this sounds like a win for developers, it often comes with a public company tax. Stricter usage policies and more aggressive enforcement of rate limits are typical when a company needs to show predictable infrastructure costs to Wall Street. We have seen this pattern before. As stability increases, the Wild West era of unlimited API experimentation ends. You might get a 90.9% uptime guarantee, but the cost of that reliability will be reflected in your monthly cloud bill. Furthermore, the risk of silent model updates where weights are tweaked for safety or efficiency without a version bump remains a top concern for reliability engineers. This raises a fundamental question. Is the increased stability worth the loss of flexibility and the inevitable price hike? This leads us to a much bigger problem concerning your infrastructure stack. The most frequent question I encounter from tech leads is it dangerous to have my entire CI/CD pipeline and customer support bot dependent on a single public AI entity? This is the vendor concentration risk. In the S1, Anthropic lists its reliance on cloud providers like AWS as a risk factor, but for you, the developer Anthropic IPO is the risk factor. If their stock price dips and they are forced to cut operational costs, your service latency might suffer. If they face an antitrust lawsuit that halts API developments, your roadmap stalls. Diversification is no longer an option, it's a necessity for 2026. You must design your abstractions so that switching from Claude to an internal Llama instance or a competitor like Gemini is a configuration change, not a full rewrite. The cost of building this AI-agnostic layer is significant, but the cost of being locked into a fluctuating public entity's ecosystem is much higher. But how does the broader community feel about this transition? Is the developer sentiment shifting from excitement to skepticism? The sentiment in developer circles, from Hacker News to Reddit, is currently split. On one hand, there is a hope that a public Anthropic will provide the long-term stability and professional SDK support that early-stage startups have lacked. On the other hand, there is a pervasive fear of inchification, the process where a platform eventually turns against its users and developers to extract value for shareholders. Developers remember the transitions of companies like Docker or Elastic, where once free or affordable features became enterprise-only overnight. The S1 filing doesn't hide the need for massive revenue growth, which developers interpret as we are the product being optimized. We see surveys indicating that while Claude is the favorite for coding logic, developers are already keeping a Llama-based lifeboat ready. This tension between needing a powerful tool and fearing its corporate evolution is the defining mood of 2026. But is this fear of closing off the ecosystem actually backed by historical data? History provides a sobering timeline for how companies change their relationship with open source and open weights as they approach an IPO. While Anthropic has never been an open company in the vein of Meta, their early commitment to transparency and constitutional AI was a major draw for the community. However, the path to a 2026 IPO usually involves a tightening of intellectual property. We've seen this with the likes of MongoDB and Elastic, who shifted licenses to protect their business from cloud giants. For Anthropic, this likely means fewer technical deep dives into their training methodologies and a more black box approach to their API. The decline of open-weight commitment in the industry is a direct response to the need to prove a proprietary moat to investors. If the model itself is the primary asset, sharing too much about its architecture is seen as a liability on a balance sheet. Now, we must consider the external forces that will act on this newly public entity, specifically the regulators. As a public AI leader, Anthropic will face unprecedented regulatory scrutiny. The S-1 filing explicitly mentions safety as a core mission, but as a public company, this mission will be tested against the fiduciary duty to shareholders. Regulators in the EU and US are already looking at AI market dominance, and Anthropic's ties to AWS and Google could trigger antitrust investigations. For you, developer, this means the API used today might be forced to change for legal reasons tomorrow. We might see safety filters that are overtuned to avoid corporate liability, potentially degrading the performance of your specialized applications. The risk isn't just that the tech changes, but that the pure legal environment surround the tech forces is a change that wasn't planned by the engineers. You need to prepare for a future where AI compliance is a major part of your development lifecycle. So, how do we decide when to stay and when to go? In the next chapter, we will build the ultimate framework for your exit strategy, knowing exactly when to pull the plug on a provider. The biggest technical debt in 2026 won't be legacy code. It will be a hard dependency on a single AI provider's proprietary API features. When Anthropic goes public, their board of directors will demand margin improvements, which often translates to higher pricing or deprecating loss leader tiers. If your codebase is littered with Anthropic-specific prompt-catching logic or tool-use schemas that don't translate to other providers, you're effectively trapped. Implementing abstraction layers like LangChain or DSPy isn't just about code cleanliness, it's a financial hedge. By wrapping Claude-specific calls in a standardized interface, you gain the ability to route traffic to alternative models the moment a price hike is announced. You must decouple the intelligent agent logic from the infrastructure provider. This architectural shift transforms a vendor-specific dependency into a flexible utility that can be swapped without a full system rewrite. But wait, is simply wrapping the API enough to protect your margins? There is a deeper layer of infrastructure you need to control. A senior developer's survival kit in 2026 includes a hybrid cloud strategy. Relying 100% on Claude for every single summarization or classification task is a recipe for budget disaster. Instead, consider a stack where local LLMs like Llama 4 or Mistral Next handle the low reasoning heavy lifting, while Claude is reserved for high-stakes reasoning or complex agentic workflows. This model tiering approach ensures that your base operating cost remains predictable, even if Anthropic's public market valuation forces them to aggressive monetization. You should be running local inference for dev test environments to save on token costs, only promoting to Claude for production-ready features. By treating Claude as an elite reasoning engine rather than a commodity utility, you maintain leverage in any future pricing negotiation. But how do you prove that a cheaper model actually performs well enough to replace Claude in specific workflows? To justify moving away from Claude or staying with it, you need more than a gut feeling. You need a proprietary benchmarking suite. Standard benchmarks like MMLU are useless for your specific business logic. In 2026, the real value for an engineering team lies in their internal evaluation dataset. This suite should consist of 500 to 1,000 golden pairs of inputs and desired outputs tailored to your main. When Anthropic updates their pricing or releases a new version, you run this suite against multiple models. This data-driven approach allows you to say to stakeholders, Model X is 40% cheaper and maintains 98% of Claude's accuracy for our specific use case. Without this, you are a hostage to Anthropic's release cycle and marketing claims. Start building your migration readiness checklist today to ensure your exit strategy is backed by hard evidence. Now, let's talk about the cold, hard numbers. How do we forecast these costs for the next 3 years? Financial planning for AI is no longer just about monthly spend. For a public company like Anthropic, token unit economics will be the primary driver of their S-1 filing. You need to forecast your 3-year AI budget with the assumption that efficiency gains in models might be offset by monetization pressure from the board. Look at the transition from 2024 to 2026. Initially, we see massive price drops as competition heats up, but post-IPO, companies often shift to high-margin premium features. Your forecast must account for token inflation, the tendency to use more tokens per request as features become more agentic. If your current unit cost is 1.11 per transaction, how does your business model look if it hits 0.5 due to a model shift or pricing pivot? This spreadsheet isn't just for the CFO, it's for the senior developer to decide which features are architecturally sustainable. Now, what can we do to lock in these costs before the IPO hype reaches its peak? Senior developers must learn to speak procurement. As Anthropic approaches its IPO date, there is a narrow window to negotiate multi-year reserved capacity contracts. Just like AWS reserved instances or Azure savings plans, AI infrastructure is moving toward commitment-based pricing. If you can forecast your baseline usage, you can lock in rates that are significantly lower than the public API price. This reserved capacity model is how Anthropic will secure committed remaining performance obligations, CRPO, to show Wall Street stable, predictable revenue. For you, this means protection against post-IPO price hikes. You should be pushing your management to sign these agreements now, while Anthropic is still in growth at all costs mode. If you wait until after the IPO, you'll be negotiating with a company that has to answer to shareholders every quarter. But what if the market takes a turn for the worse? You need scenarios. In the world of high-stakes AI infrastructure, hope is not a strategy. You need 3 distinct scenarios: the optimistic path, where Anthropic stays affordable, the margin squeeze, where prices double, and the enterprise pivot, where the best models are locked behind expensive tiers. If the enterprise pivot happens, your exit strategy must be ready to execute. This involves having your abstraction layers tested, your local model infrastructure warmed up, and your legal team briefed on the migration clauses of your contracts. By planning for these scenarios now, you transition from being a passive consumer of AI to an active architect of your company's financial and technical future. The Anthropic IPO is a signal that the wild west of free and cheap AI is ending. Are you ready to lead your team through the fallout? In our final chapter, we will synthesize everything and look at the actual landscape of the AI ecosystem once the IPO dust settles in 2026. As we wrap up our analysis, the critical question remains: where should you commit your limited development resources? Right now, Anthropic's Claude 3.5 series offers unparalleled developer experience and reasoning capabilities, making it the go-to for rapid prototyping and complex coding tasks. However, as Anthropic transitions to a public entity, their pricing models and API stability will be dictated by quarterly earnings reports rather than pure research altruism. To avoid catastrophic technical debt, you must treat Claude as your high-speed execution engine while simultaneously architecting your system for model agnosticism. This means abstracting your prompt engineering layers and maintaining a parallel pipeline for Llama 3 or GPT-01. The goal is to leverage Claude's current lead without becoming a hostage to their eventual public market price hikes. By maintaining this hybrid agility, you ensure your infrastructure remains resilient regardless of who wins the IPO race. But what does this shift mean for the core logic of the code itself? Let's look at the concept of Software 3.0. This Anthropic IPO isn't just a financial event, it's the formal graduation ceremony for what Andrej Karpathy famously termed Software 3.0. In Software 1.0, we wrote code line by line. In Software 2.0, we used neural networks as optimization modules. Now, in the 3.0 era, the foundation model itself becomes the core operating system of your application. When a company like Anthropic goes public, it signals that these probabilistic weights are no longer experimental lab artifacts, but critical industrial infrastructure, similar to how AWS transformed from an internal tool to a global utility. For you as a developer, this means your value moves from writing the logic to orchestrating the weights and managing the data flywheel. We are moving into a world where the compiler is a multi-billion-dollar public corporation. This shift creates a new hierarchy of power in the tech stack where the model provider holds the keys to your product's performance. But this new industrial era comes with a hidden tax that most startups aren't prepared for. The final takeaway for the year 2026 is a sobering one. The era of cheap AI experimentation is officially over. For years, venture capital has effectively subsidized the compute costs of your API calls, allowing developers to build inefficient wrappers on top of massive models. Once Anthropic hits the public market, the pressure for gay profitability will force them to tighten margins, likely leading to higher API costs or reduced free-tier capabilities. This is the same trajectory we saw with various SaaS giants. The honeymoon phase of subsidized growth eventually yields to the reality of public market expectations. As a senior developer or CTO, your strategy must pivot from growth at any cost to efficiency at all costs. This means investing in local small language models and RAG architectures that minimize token usage. The Anthropic IPO is your final warning to optimize your token economy before the quarterly earnings calls start dictating your burn rate. This concludes our deep dive into the Anthropic S1 and its impact on your development budget. Now, the real work begins as you implement these strategies in your next sprint.